Reverend Elijah Jackson adjusted the worn collar of his clerical shirt, a familiar comfort in the face of unfamiliar anxieties. The crisp autumn air nipped at his cheeks, a stark contrast to the warmth he usually felt within the sanctuary walls of his small church. Today, however, the sanctuary felt miles away, replaced by a gnawing unease in his stomach. He stood before the brightly painted building of the community harvest food pantry, a beacon of hope for many, but a place that now filled him with a hesitant dread. Elijah wasn't a stranger to hardship. He'd spent his life ministering to the downtrodden, offering solace and spiritual guidance to those struggling to make ends meet. He'd seen poverty firsthand, smelled its lingering scent of desperation, and felt its icy grip on families clinging to hope. But this was different. This was him needing help. A recent unexpected medical bill, coupled with a downturn in donations to his small church, had left him in a precarious financial position. His meager savings had dwindled, and the prospect of putting food on his table felt increasingly daunting. Pride warred with necessity. He'd always been the giver, the provider, the rock for his community. Asking for help felt like a betrayal of his own self-image, a humbling admission of vulnerability. He took a deep breath, the scent of freshly fallen leaves doing little to calm his racing heart. He smoothed his hands over his well-worn trousers, the fabric thin and showing its age. He'd patched them countless times, just as he'd patched the lives of countless parishioners over the years. He straightened his shoulders, reminding himself of the countless times he'd offered comfort and strength to others, and resolved to face this challenge with the same dignity and grace. The pantry door, a cheerful yellow, seemed to mock his apprehension. He pushed it open, the bell above jingling a discordant welcome. The interior was surprisingly spacious, filled with neatly organized shelves stocked with canned goods, boxes of pasta, bags of rice, and other staples. Volunteers bustled about, their movements efficient and organized. A low hum of activity filled the air, a mix of whispered conversations and the rustling of bags. Elijah approached the reception desk, a simple wooden structure positioned near the entrance. A young woman, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, sat behind it, meticulously organizing paperwork. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral, almost indifferent. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet space. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little softer than usual, a tremor betraying his nervousness. I'm Reverend Jackson from St. Michael's Church." The woman's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, her eyes scanning him from head to toe with an unnerving intensity. He felt a prickle of unease, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't the warmth of welcome he'd expected, but a coldness that seemed to emanate from her very being. I'm in need of some assistance," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I've had some unexpected expenses, and I'm finding it difficult to—" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The shame of his situation threatened to overwhelm him. The woman's lips tightened, a subtle change in her demeanor that Elijah couldn't quite place. She didn't speak, simply stared at him, her gaze unwavering and intensely scrutinizing. He shifted uncomfortably, the silence stretching into an uncomfortable expanse. He felt the weight of her judgment, a heavy cloak settling upon his shoulders. He waited, his heart pounding a rhythm of anxiety against his ribs. This was not the compassionate welcome he had anticipated. This was something else entirely. Something colder, something harsher, something wrong. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the faint rustling of papers and the distant hum of conversation. Reverend Jackson shifted again, the uncomfortable silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He cleared his throat, attempting to break the tension, but the woman behind the desk remained impassive, her gaze still fixed upon him with an unsettling intensity. He felt a growing unease, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that suggested something was amiss. Finally, she spoke, her voice sharp and clipped, devoid of any warmth or empathy. "And what kind of assistance do you require, Reverend?" The formality of her address felt strangely out of place, almost mocking in its stark contrast to the coldness in her tone. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. I, I require some food assistance, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. A recent medical bill, coupled with some unforeseen circumstances at the church. He trailed off, unable to articulate the full extent of his financial predicament. The words felt inadequate, insufficient to convey the depth of his need. The woman, whose name tag identified her as Sarah Miller, leaned back in her chair, her expression unchanged. Her eyes, however, narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that betrayed a flicker of something akin to suspicion, or perhaps even hostility. He felt a sudden chill, a premonition of trouble that sent a shiver down his spine. "And where do you live, Reverend?" she asked, her voice sharper now, laced with a distinct edge of skepticism. The question felt intrusive, almost accusatory. He hesitated, surprised by the unexpected line of questioning. "Just a few blocks from here," he replied, his voice slightly defensive. "On Elm Street." Sarah Miller's lips tightened, a subtle movement that betrayed her inner thoughts. She tapped a long, perfectly manicured fingernail against the desk, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that bordered on aggression. The atmosphere in the small room had shifted dramatically, the initial unease now replaced by a palpable tension. "I see," she said, her voice dripping with unconcealed doubt. "And how long have you lived in this community, Reverend?" He felt a surge of indignation, a prickle of resentment at the implied accusation in her tone. He'd lived in this community for over 20 years, ministering to its people, offering comfort and guidance during times of both joy and sorrow. He'd been a pillar of the community, a constant presence in times of need. And yet, here he was being questioned as if he were an outsider, a stranger, an intruder. "Over 20 years," he replied, his voice firm, his dignity struggling to maintain its composure. "I've served this community faithfully for over 2 decades. I know many of the people here, and I've always been willing to lend a hand to those in need." Sarah Miller didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes piercing and unwavering. Then, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "We try to prioritize those who truly need our help, Reverend," she said, her words laced with a thinly veiled implication. "Those who are actually part of this community. Those who aren't just passing through." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He felt a wave of anger wash over him, a burning resentment at the blatant racism underlying her words. He'd dedicated his life to serving this community, and yet he was being treated with suspicion, judged and dismissed based on the color of his skin. The initial anxiety he'd felt was now replaced by a burning sense of injustice. He had come here seeking help, not to be subjected to this blatant discrimination. His quiet dignity was being challenged, and he was determined to stand his ground. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension replacing the initial awkwardness. Reverend Jackson felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that battled with his ingrained politeness. He opened his mouth to retort, to defend himself against the insidious racism veiled in Sarah Miller's words, but she cut him off before he could speak. "We have limited resources, Reverend," she continued, her voice tight with what he could only interpret as thinly veiled hostility. "And we need to make sure those resources go to the people who truly need them, the people who are actually part of this community." She paused, her eyes lingering on him, her meaning unmistakable. The sting of her words was sharp, a blatant disregard for his years of service and contribution to the community. He'd always been a giver, a pillar of support for those in need, regardless of their background or circumstances. And now, he was being treated as an outsider, an unwelcome guest, simply because of the color of his skin. "With all due respect, Ms. Miller," he began, his voice steady despite the rising anger within him. "I have lived in this community for over 2 decades. I've served this community faithfully, offering spiritual guidance and support to countless individuals, regardless of their background or circumstances." He paused, taking a deep breath to control his rising emotions. "To suggest that I am not part of this community is not only insulting, but also deeply offensive." Sarah Miller remained unmoved, her expression unchanged. She simply stared at him, her gaze unwavering and intensely scrutinizing. She didn't offer an apology, didn't even acknowledge the validity of his words. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We've had problems in the past, Reverend," she said, her words laced with a subtle threat. "People coming in, taking advantage of our generosity, depleting our resources for those who truly need them. We've had to be more selective, more careful about who we help." The implication was clear, a thinly veiled accusation that he was one of those people, one of those who were taking advantage of the system. He felt a wave of nausea, a sickening realization that his need for help was being twisted into a justification for blatant discrimination. "Are you suggesting that I am taking advantage of this pantry?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but laced with a steel-like edge. "Are you accusing me of being dishonest, of not deserving the help I need?" Sarah Miller didn't answer directly. Instead, she gestured vaguely towards the shelves overflowing with food, her eyes sweeping across the room as if to emphasize the scarcity of resources. "We have to prioritize," she repeated, her voice hard and uncompromising. "We have to make sure that the food goes to the people who truly need it, the families who live here, the people who work here, the people who are truly part of this community." She paused, her gaze lingering on him, her meaning unmistakable. "And you, Reverend, you don't quite fit that description." The blatant racism in her statement was undeniable, a stark and painful reminder of the prejudices that still lingered in the hearts of some. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that threatened to overwhelm him. But he held himself back, reminding himself that his dignity and composure were more powerful weapons than any outburst of rage. He would not let her win, not let her diminish him with her hateful words. He would fight back, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of his conviction and the unwavering truth of his actions. This was not just about food. It was about justice, about equality, about the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of one's skin. Reverend Jackson stood silently, absorbing the sting of Sarah Miller's words. The blatant racism, thinly veiled under the guise of resource management, hung heavy in the air. He felt the eyes of other patrons on him, a silent audience witnessing the unfolding humiliation. He'd always strived to maintain his composure, to be a beacon of calm amidst the storms of life, but the injustice of the situation threatened to shatter his carefully constructed facade. He glanced around the pantry, noticing the subtle shifts in the other patrons' body language. Some averted their gazes, uncomfortable witnesses to the unfolding confrontation. Others whispered amongst themselves, their hushed tones carrying a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. A few, however, openly stared, their expressions ranging from curious to outright judgmental. The initial hum of activity had ceased, replaced by a tense silence, a palpable sense of unease that hung heavy in the air. A young mother, her two children clinging to her legs, shifted nervously, her eyes darting between Reverend Jackson and Sarah Miller. An elderly woman, her face etched with the lines of a life lived with quiet dignity, clutched her shopping bag tighter, her gaze fixed on the scene with a mixture of sadness and disapproval. A young man, his face obscured by a baseball cap, fidgeted with his hands, his body language betraying his discomfort. The atmosphere had transformed from the usual organized bustle of a food pantry into a charged space, thick with unspoken tension. The air crackled with the unspoken words, the silent judgments, the simmering anger. Reverend Jackson felt the weight of it all, the collective gaze of the other patrons adding to the burden of Sarah Miller's discriminatory words. He was no longer just facing Sarah. He was facing the silent complicity of the entire room. Sarah Miller, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the shifting dynamics of the room, continued her tirade. "We have to be responsible, Reverend," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We can't just give away our resources to anyone who asks. We have to prioritize those who truly belong to this community." Her words, though ostensibly about resource management, were clearly coded messages of racial exclusion. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that threatened to boil over. But he held it back, reminding himself that a controlled response would be more effective than a fiery outburst. He needed to make his point, to expose her prejudice without stooping to her level. He took a deep breath, composing himself. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your words are deeply offensive. My contributions to this community speak for themselves. I have lived here for over 2 decades, ministering to the needs of its people, offering comfort and support to those in need, regardless of their background or circumstances. To suggest that I am not part of this community is not only insulting, but it is a blatant display of prejudice." His words hung in the air, a challenge to Sarah Miller and a silent appeal to the other patrons. He looked at the young mother, the elderly woman, the young man, and others. He saw a flicker of understanding in their eyes, a recognition of the injustice unfolding before them. The silent complicity was beginning to crack, the unspoken judgments giving way to a nascent sense of collective unease. The tension in the room intensified, the silence growing heavier, more charged, as the unspoken question hung in the air. Would anyone speak up? Would anyone challenge Sarah's blatant racism? The weight of that question fell heavily on Reverend Jackson's shoulders, adding to the burden of the public humiliation he was enduring. Sarah Miller remained impassive, her expression unchanged despite Reverend Jackson's impassioned plea. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. The other patrons watched, a silent audience to the unfolding drama, their faces a mixture of discomfort, sympathy, and perhaps a touch of fear. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgments, a silent condemnation of Sarah Miller's actions. Yet, no one spoke up, no one intervened. Reverend Jackson felt a wave of despair wash over him, a crushing weight of disappointment and shame. He'd faced hardship before, endured countless trials and tribulations, but this was different. This was not just a personal struggle. It was a public humiliation, a blatant display of racism that left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. He'd dedicated his life to serving this community, offering comfort and support to those in need, and yet he was being treated with such contempt, such blatant disregard for his dignity. Sarah Miller finally broke the silence, her voice devoid of any empathy or remorse. "I'm sorry, Reverend," she said, her tone clipped and formal, lacking any sincerity. "But we can't provide you with assistance today. Our resources are limited, and we have to prioritize those who are truly in need." Her words were a thinly veiled insult, a blatant rejection masked by a veneer of bureaucratic formality. The sting of her words was sharp, a cruel twist of the knife. He'd come here seeking help, not seeking confrontation, not expecting to be subjected to such blatant discrimination. He'd approached the situation with dignity, with restraint, hoping to resolve the matter calmly and rationally. But Sarah Miller had refused to engage in a rational conversation, choosing instead to resort to prejudice and exclusion. He felt a surge of anger, a righteous indignation that threatened to overwhelm him. But he held it back, reminding himself that losing his composure would only play into Sarah Miller's hands. He would not let her win, not let her diminish him with her hateful words. He stood silently for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his emotions swirling within him like a tempest. The shame of his situation was profound, a deep wound inflicted not just by Sarah Miller's words, but by the silent complicity of the other patrons. He'd always been the giver, the provider, the one who offered support and comfort to others. And now he was the one in need, the one being rejected, the one being humiliated. He straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his composure. He wouldn't let this defeat him. He wouldn't let Sarah Miller's prejudice diminish his spirit. He would find another way, another source of help. He would not be broken. He turned and walked away, his head held high, his dignity intact despite the sting of rejection. He left the pantry, the cheerful yellow door now a symbol of his humiliation, a stark reminder of the prejudice he had encountered. The silence of the other patrons followed him, a silent testament to the power of unspoken complicity. The weight of the rejection pressed down on him, a heavy burden of shame and disappointment. But beneath the pain, a flicker of resolve ignited, a determination to fight back, to expose the injustice, to ensure that no one else would suffer the same humiliation he had endured. He would find justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced by prejudice and discrimination. The aftermath of Reverend Jackson's rejection hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension replacing the usual organized bustle of the community harvest food pantry. The cheerful yellow walls seemed to absorb the weight of the unspoken accusations and the silent judgments, the air thick with a mixture of discomfort and unease. The incident had shattered the veneer of normalcy, leaving behind a residue of awkwardness and unspoken questions. As Reverend Jackson walked away, a hush fell over the remaining patrons. The young mother, her children still clinging to her legs, looked down at the floor, her face a mask of sadness and concern. The elderly woman, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment, shook her head slightly, a silent condemnation of Sarah Miller's actions. The young man, his baseball cap still pulled low, fidgeted nervously, his discomfort palpable. The whispers began almost immediately, soft at first, then growing louder as the initial shock wore off. The incident had broken the unspoken rules of polite silence, creating a space for open discussion, albeit one shrouded in hushed tones and furtive glances. "Did you see that?" One woman whispered to another, her voice barely audible above the subdued hum of activity. "That was awful. How could she do that?" "I know," the other woman replied, shaking her head. "Reverend Jackson has been such a pillar of this community. He's always helping others, and she treats him like that." Their conversation was quickly joined by others, a ripple effect of whispered discussions spreading throughout the pantry. The initial shock was giving way to outrage, the silent complicity of the witnesses slowly eroding as the injustice of Sarah Miller's actions became more apparent. The volunteers, too, were affected by the incident. Some, like Sarah Miller, seemed to remain unmoved, their faces impassive, their expressions betraying no remorse. Others, however, showed signs of discomfort, their body language betraying their unease. They exchanged furtive glances, their hushed conversations a mixture of concern and apprehension. "I can't believe Sarah did that," one volunteer whispered to another, her voice filled with a mixture of shock and disapproval. "Reverend Jackson is one of the kindest men I know. He's always donating to the pantry, always helping others. And she just rejected him." "I know," the other volunteer replied, shaking her head. "It was awful. I'm embarrassed to be associated with her." The unease spread like wildfire, infecting the entire pantry. The usual atmosphere of organized efficiency was replaced by a palpable sense of tension, a collective discomfort that overshadowed the usual routine. The incident had exposed a deep-seated prejudice, a blatant disregard for the principles of compassion and equality that the pantry was supposed to represent. The whispers and hushed conversations were not just about Reverend Jackson's rejection. They were about the systemic racism that had allowed such an act of discrimination to occur. The seeds of change had been sown, the quiet whispers a prelude to a much larger reckoning. The weekly community meeting was held in the town hall, a familiar space for sharing concerns and celebrating successes. Tonight, however, the air was thick with a different kind of energy, a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the incident at the food pantry. The usual jovial atmosphere had been replaced by a subdued quiet, a collective unease that permeated the room. Reverend Jackson sat near the back, his presence a silent reminder of the injustice that had occurred. He hadn't planned on attending, but the whispers and hushed conversations following the incident had made it impossible to ignore the growing unease within the community. He needed to be present, to witness the unfolding events, to gauge the community's response to Sarah Miller's actions. The meeting began with the usual announcements and updates on local initiatives. But the underlying tension was undeniable, a silent current that ran beneath the surface of polite conversation. People exchanged furtive glances, their hushed whispers a testament to the lingering discomfort. The discussion eventually turned to the community harvest food pantry, its operations, and its role within the community. The pantry organizers, a group of dedicated volunteers, began their report, their usual enthusiasm tempered by a cautious awareness of the incident. They spoke of the pantry's successes, its efforts to provide food assistance to those in need, and its commitment to serving the community. But the elephant in the room remained unspoken, a silent presence that overshadowed their words. The tension in the room grew palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions and simmering resentments. Finally, someone broke the silence. "What about what happened to Reverend Jackson?" A woman's voice cut through the hushed atmosphere, her words clear and direct. The question hung in the air, a challenge to the organizers, a demand for accountability. The organizers exchanged uneasy glances, their faces a mixture of surprise and apprehension. They had hoped to avoid the issue, to gloss over the incident and move on. But the question had been asked, the silence broken, the unspoken tension now brought into the open. One of the organizers, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Henderson, stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. We are aware of the incident," she began, her words hesitant and uncertain. "And we are deeply sorry for what happened." Her apology, however, felt inadequate, insufficient to address the gravity of the situation. The silence that followed was even more charged than before, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. Reverend Jackson watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. He knew this was the moment of truth, the moment when the community would either confront its prejudices or allow them to fester. The weight of the community's response rested heavily on his shoulders. The quiet whispers had given way to a silent expectation, a collective holding of breath as they awaited the next words. The future of the pantry, and perhaps the community itself, hung in the balance. Mrs. Henderson paused, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, a palpable tension hanging in the air. The unspoken questions, the simmering resentments, the collective unease, all of it converged into a single point of anticipation. Reverend Jackson sat quietly, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting for the next words to fall. Then Mrs. Henderson took a deep breath, her voice gaining strength and clarity. "We have something to share with you all," she said, her tone serious and measured. "Something that will hopefully shed some light on what happened at the pantry earlier this week." She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her, every ear straining to hear the next words. The tension was almost unbearable, a palpable energy that filled the space. "For years," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "the Community Harvest Food Pantry has received significant anonymous donations. Donations that have kept us afloat, that have allowed us to provide food assistance to countless families in need. Donations that have been crucial to our success." She paused again, letting the implications of her words sink in. The room buzzed with whispers, the murmurs of surprise and disbelief mingling with the growing realization of what she was about to reveal. "These donations," she said, her voice clear and strong, "have come from a single source, a source that has remained anonymous until now." She took another deep breath, her eyes scanning the room, her gaze settling on Reverend Jackson. The silence in the room was absolute, a collective holding of breath as everyone waited for the revelation. "The anonymous donor," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and reverence, "is Reverend Elijah Jackson." A gasp rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath as the truth hit home. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, the implications of the revelation sinking in. Reverend Jackson, the man who had been unjustly denied assistance, was the very person who had kept the pantry alive for years. The irony was staggering, the injustice profound. Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice thick with emotion. "For years, Reverend Jackson has quietly and anonymously supported this pantry, donating a significant portion of his own meager resources. He has never sought recognition, never asked for anything in return. He has simply given, out of the kindness of his heart, out of his deep commitment to serving this community." The room erupted in a mixture of gasps, murmurs, and whispered apologies. The weight of the revelation was immense, the shame of their collective ignorance palpable. They had judged a man based on the color of his skin, failing to recognize his immense contribution to their community. The silence of the previous days was replaced by a wave of remorse, a collective awakening to the depth of their prejudice. The incident at the food pantry had exposed not just Sarah Miller's bigotry, but also the community's own implicit biases. The revelation of Reverend Jackson's generosity was a turning point, a moment of truth that would irrevocably change the course of the community. The revelation of Reverend Jackson's generous and anonymous donations hung in the air, a heavy weight of shame and remorse settling upon the community. The initial shock gave way to a wave of anger, directed not just at Sarah Miller, but also at themselves for their collective blindness and implicit acceptance of her prejudice. The silence that had followed Mrs. Henderson's announcement was broken by a ripple of murmurs, a collective expression of disbelief and outrage. Sarah Miller, sitting near the front of the room, remained impassive, her face a mask of strained composure. But her body language betrayed her discomfort, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The weight of the community's collective gaze pressed down on her, a silent condemnation of her actions. The first to speak was the young mother who had witnessed the incident at the food pantry. Her voice, initially hesitant, grew stronger as she spoke, her words fueled by righteous anger. "How could you?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could you treat Reverend Jackson like that? He's been supporting this pantry for years, and you deny him help because of the color of his skin?" Her words unleashed a torrent of emotion, a wave of anger and indignation that swept through the room. Others joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. The whispers turned into accusations, the murmurs into shouts. Sarah Miller's prejudice was laid bare, her discriminatory behavior exposed for all to see. The elderly woman, who had also witnessed the incident, spoke next, her voice filled with quiet but unwavering strength. "I've known Reverend Jackson for years," she said, her words carrying the weight of her long experience. "He's always been kind and generous, always willing to help others. And you treated him like he was some kind of outsider, some kind of criminal." One by one, community members voiced their anger and disappointment. The initial shock and disbelief gave way to a collective reckoning, a confrontation with the prejudice that had been allowed to fester within their community. Sarah Miller's attempt to justify her actions by invoking concerns about resource management was met with scorn and disbelief. Her words, once cloaked in the guise of administrative efficiency, were now exposed as a thinly veiled excuse for racism. The pantry organizers, initially hesitant and apologetic, now stood firm, their voices filled with a newfound resolve. They condemned Sarah Miller's actions unequivocally, expressing their deep remorse for allowing such blatant discrimination to occur. They pledged to implement changes to prevent future incidents, promising diversity training for all volunteers and a review of their intake procedures to ensure equitable access for all community members. Sarah Miller sat silently, her face pale, her body trembling slightly. The weight of the community's collective condemnation was immense, her prejudice exposed for all to see. The silence that followed was not one of tension, but of profound shame and regret. A collective acknowledgement of the harm caused by her actions and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable community. The meeting, initially intended to discuss the pantry's operations, had transformed into a powerful reckoning, a community-wide confrontation with its own hidden prejudices. The initial wave of anger and condemnation gave way to a more nuanced and complex discussion, a tense exchange of views that laid bare the community's deep-seated prejudices and implicit biases. The focus shifted from Sarah Miller's individual actions to a broader examination of the systemic issues that had allowed such blatant discrimination to occur. The young man who had witnessed the incident at the food pantry spoke up, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and frustration. "It's not just about Sarah," he said, his words carrying the weight of his conviction. "It's about the way this pantry has been run, the way we've allowed prejudice to creep into our system. We need to examine our own biases, our own assumptions, and make sure this never happens again." His words resonated with many in the room, triggering a wave of self-reflection and introspection. The community members began to share their own experiences with prejudice and discrimination, both within the pantry and beyond. Stories emerged of subtle slights, of microaggressions, of implicit biases that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged for too long. An elderly woman, her voice trembling with emotion, shared her story of being treated with suspicion and disrespect at the pantry. Her request for assistance met with skepticism and delay. A young mother recounted her experience of being judged and shamed for seeking help, her dignity undermined by the implicit biases of some volunteers. A young man described his own struggles with accessing resources. His request for assistance met with indifference and dismissiveness. The discussion was tense, filled with moments of anger, frustration, and even tears. But it was also a powerful testament to the community's willingness to confront its own shortcomings, to acknowledge its own complicity in perpetuating systemic injustice. The initial focus on Sarah Miller's individual actions had broadened into a wider examination of the community's own biases and the systemic issues that had allowed such discrimination to occur. The pantry organizers, initially defensive, began to listen, to learn, to understand the depth of the community's pain and frustration. They acknowledged their own shortcomings, their own failure to create a truly inclusive and equitable environment. They pledged to implement systemic changes, not just policy adjustments, but a fundamental shift in their approach to serving the community. The discussion was not easy, not without its moments of tension and disagreement. But it was a necessary conversation, a crucial step in the process of healing and reconciliation. The community was confronting its own demons, acknowledging its own complicity in perpetuating systemic injustice, and committing to creating a more just and equitable future. The incident at the food pantry, though painful and humiliating, had become a catalyst for change, a turning point that would irrevocably alter the community's trajectory. The confrontation was not just about Sarah Miller. It was about the community's collective responsibility to create a more just and equitable society. The tense discussion eventually subsided, giving way to a more conciliatory tone. The community, having confronted its own prejudices and implicit biases, began to focus on the path forward, on the steps needed to prevent future incidents of discrimination. The pantry organizers, having listened intently to the community's concerns, stepped forward, their voices filled with a newfound resolve. Mrs. Henderson, her face etched with both remorse and determination, addressed the community directly. "We are deeply sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine regret. "We are truly sorry for what happened to Reverend Jackson, and for the pain and suffering that our actions, or inaction, have caused. We failed you, and we take full responsibility for our shortcomings." Her apology was heartfelt and sincere, a stark contrast to Sarah Miller's earlier, insincere attempt at deflection. The community listened intently, their initial anger slowly giving way to a cautious optimism. Mrs. Henderson's words were not just an apology. They were a promise of change, a commitment to creating a more just and equitable environment. "We understand that an apology is not enough," she continued, her voice gaining strength and clarity. "We need to take concrete steps to prevent future incidents of discrimination. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed such blatant prejudice to occur." She outlined a series of concrete actions the pantry would take to ensure equitable access for all community members. These included mandatory diversity training for all volunteers, a complete review of intake procedures to eliminate any potential for bias, and the establishment of a community advisory board to provide oversight and guidance. The diversity training, she explained, would focus on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of treating all community members with dignity and respect. The review of intake procedures would aim to eliminate any barriers to access, ensuring that all individuals, regardless of their background or circumstances, could receive the assistance they needed without facing discrimination. The Community Advisory Board would provide a platform for community members to voice their concerns, to offer feedback, and to ensure that the pantry remained accountable to its constituents. The community responded positively to the organizers' proposals. their initial anger and frustration slowly giving way to hope and optimism. They recognized that the changes proposed were not just symbolic gestures, but concrete steps towards creating a more just and equitable environment. The discussion that followed was constructive and collaborative, with community members offering suggestions and insights to further enhance the pantry's efforts. The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of purpose and a collective commitment to building a more inclusive and just community. The incident at the food pantry, though painful and humiliating, had become a catalyst for change, a turning point that would irrevocably alter the community's trajectory. The apology and the commitment to change were not just words. They were a promise of a better future, a future where all community members would be treated with dignity and respect, where prejudice would be challenged, and where everyone would have equal access to the resources they needed. The path forward was clear, and the community was ready to walk it together. In the weeks that followed the community meeting, a palpable shift occurred. The initial anger and resentment gave way to a process of healing and reconciliation, a renewed focus on inclusivity and equitable access to resources. The incident at the food pantry, though painful, had served as a catalyst for positive change, prompting a deeper understanding of compassion and empathy within the community. The pantry organizers immediately implemented the changes they had pledged, initiating diversity training for all volunteers, and revising their intake procedures to eliminate any potential for bias. A community advisory board was established, comprised of diverse members representing various segments of the community. The board met regularly, providing valuable feedback and ensuring that the pantry remained accountable to its constituents. Sarah Miller, after a period of reflection and self-assessment, resigned from her volunteer position at the pantry. While her actions had caused significant harm, the community recognized the importance of allowing her space for personal growth and rehabilitation. Her departure, however, was not seen as an end, but as a necessary step in the process of healing and reconciliation. Reverend Jackson, initially hesitant, agreed to meet with Sarah Miller privately. The meeting was not about forgiveness, but about understanding, about acknowledging the harm caused and committing to a future of mutual respect. Sarah Miller expressed her remorse, acknowledging the depth of her prejudice and the pain she had caused. Reverend Jackson, in turn, shared his own experiences with racism and discrimination, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding. The community, inspired by Reverend Jackson's quiet generosity and unwavering dignity, embarked on a series of initiatives to promote inclusivity and equity. A community garden was established, providing fresh produce to those in need and fostering a sense of shared responsibility. A series of workshops and educational programs were organized, focusing on topics such as unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of treating all community members with dignity and respect. Reverend Jackson, once again, became a beacon of hope and inspiration, his quiet generosity inspiring a deeper understanding of compassion and empathy within the community. He continued to serve his congregation, offering spiritual guidance and support to those in need. He also remained involved with the food pantry, offering his wisdom and guidance to ensure that the changes implemented were sustainable and effective. The incident at the food pantry had left a lasting impact, but it was an impact that ultimately led to positive change. The community had confronted its own prejudices, acknowledged its own shortcomings, and committed to creating a more just and equitable future. The healing process was ongoing, but the community was united in its commitment to fostering a culture of inclusivity, empathy, and mutual respect. Reverend Jackson's quiet generosity had not only saved the food pantry, but had also inspired a profound transformation within the community, leaving a legacy of compassion and understanding that would endure for years to come.